By the time he stands under that bright, manicured awning and laughs at me like I am a punchline, he will not know the shape of the world I have been carving into my head for 3 years. He will not know that I have been counting his steps for months, cataloging his little rituals, marking the times his mouth twitches before a lie. That scene is the thing I keep replaying at night, a future snapshot with a man who thinks he already owns me, but I am telling you this now because when you hear the rest, it will make sense why I did what I did. For now, though, rewind with me to the place I live, the slow crawl back to where the soldier in me learned to watch rather than be seen. I live low where light forgets to bother. My bed is a roll of stained blankets behind a shuttered storefront that smells like old paper and salt from the nearby river. When there is rain, it tries to find every crack in the city's face and remind me that everything is porous. People pass by without seeing me because they have schedules and screens and a kind of polite blindness perfected over years. I have lost the easy things: a house that stayed warm, a name that wasn't attached to a case number, a mailbox that belonged to me, but I have not lost the way I look at people. I still count the way shoulders tense before a lie, the small changes in breathing when someone tells a story they are still living, the way a watch face gives away impatience or the lack of it. Those details are the old tools in new hands, and they keep me alive in a world that prefers I be invisible. I used to be someone they read about in brochures or used as the face of a campaign: precise, cold when necessary, a man who could get in and out of a position with no drama and leave no footprints. Recon, they called it. I called it a habit of observation. I learned to move like a shadow that knows when light is coming, to take in a room's pulse in the space of a single heartbeat. Then the fall happened. They called it a scandal. They called it a mistake I could rectify if I had enough pride left to care. The truth was uglier. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time when someone higher up needed a scapegoat and my name fit better than his. There were memos altered, a witness coached, and a parade of faces who decided that my service was expendable in exchange for their clean hands. I was stripped of ribbons of clearance, of a rank that felt heavier the day it was taken off my chest than it ever had the day I earned it. The paperwork said dishonorable. The men in suits smiled in the courthouse photos. The ones who matter never took off their collars. After that, I learned to accept small things as luxury. A warm coffee from the volunteer truck tasted like victory. A free haircut from a program that already judged me came with a look that I cataloged, pity edged with impatience, the look of someone who has forgotten why lines on a uniform matter. I kept a routine because my body refused to be idle. Morning light is for running routes in my head, testing the city's rhythms. I map garbage pickup times and the exact second a particular streetlight flickers at the intersection by the bank. I watch a man who feeds pigeons on Tuesdays and recognize when his hands twitch toward his pocket, because a memory tells me that pocket used to hide a badge. I watch not because I have nothing else to do, but because these small patterns make a map of the city that could turn an adversary's arrogance into a predictable sequence. People make assumptions about the homeless or the disgraced. They think our days are flat, that trauma is an unchanging landscape. They forget how dangerous boredom can be for a trained mind. My training sits like a second skin. I still make lists, still rehearse contingencies, still know how to set up a perimeter with nothing but conversation and timing. I can tell when a person entering a room will be a threat because of where they look first, and I can tell when a security camera has a blind spot because of the angle of light on its casing. Those are not tricks. They are muscle memory. Sometimes it surprises me how precise I can still be, how my eyes will pick up a thread of inconsistency from a man who claims he never signed the orders that ruin me. The source of my fall is not only the paperwork and the men with clean collars. It is also a betrayal by someone who wore the same uniform, someone I trusted to watch my back. He stood on the witness stand and split the difference between loyalty and an easy life. He told a story that freed himself and nailed me to a narrative that suited the higher-ups. I remember him smiling like he had not seen the nights I spent trying to piece together a life out of rust. I remember the way the judge did not look at me when he read the verdict. Those faces became my weather. I learned to predict their movements, to watch for the moment someone thinks a man on the ground is finished. That is where the hawk in me went dormant and where the strategist crouched listening. So I watch, I take notes in the margins of a life I never wanted to read again. I collect the small things, which coffees are free at certain hours, which security cameras have lenses cracked just enough to make a black hole, which courier always leaves a package 5 minutes too early. I do not move like a man planning a crime, I move like a man rehearsing survival. But survival and strategy are close cousins, and as the nights pass and as I tally these small victories, I can feel the knot inside me rearrange from shame into something more like impatience. I am a quiet observer for now, a ghost in the street, but ghosts have bones and teeth and memories, and they are not as harmless as people assume. He was smiling from under an expensive hat when the microphone found him, and his laugh landed like a brick on everything I had tried to keep whole. The place was glass and lights and polite clapping, a charity gala with ribbon cutting and a buffet that smelled like money. I had gone because word got around that they were handing out winter coats to vets, because some volunteer had left a note at the shelter that named the address and the time. I had no place to go and no business being anywhere important, but the cold had teeth and pride is a poor source of warmth. So I stood near the back where shadows pooled, listening like I always do, counting the way men in suits wipe crumbs from their jawlines and nod at men in suits with thicker wallets. The lights made the room look important. The cameras made everyone look harmless. He was introduced as a philanthropist and a friend of servicemen, and his name was printed on brochures meant to wash away guilt. He had a smile that was practiced and a laugh that came early, the kind that tells you he thinks he has already won. On stage, he talked about sacrifice and giving back. He talked about programs and partnerships and how no one who had served would be left behind. I remembered the man in the courthouse who had smiled for cameras the way he did now. Maybe that made me notice the way his cufflinks matched the corporation that had signed off on the memo that ruined me. Maybe that was why my skin tightened in a way that felt like recognition. I kept my distance and my eyes, and when the moment came where they called for veterans to come forward for coats, I stepped out of the rain and toward a table with my hands open, not asking for anything but accepting what someone else was willing to give. It started small and perfect in its cruelty. A young woman with a clipboard asked me my name, and the smile that had been a promise on the stage skated over to check something in a tablet. He looked at my face and at the dog tags I had tucked inside my shirt out of habit, the little medal sleeping next to my ribs like a promise I refused to bury. His brow twitched, the kind of twitch a man uses to show contempt without dirtying his hands. He turned to the camera and said my name wrong in front of a microphone, as if he were renaming me for a broadcast. He called me an imposter, a fake soldier taking advantage of real programs. He said it loud enough that the clip would play later with his smile intact. He announced that someone would be checking our papers and our stories, and that those who lied would not only be removed, they would be named. I tried to tell him that I had served, that I had the paperwork somewhere, that I had been cleared before everything got rewritten, but his assistant already had a voice clipped over mine and the cameras picked it up with the reverence of a judge. He had arranged it. Someone in the back had slipped a file into the tablet that said I had been discharged under dishonorable conditions, a black and white line that meant the world had an excuse to redirect its shame at me. It was a lie wrapped in a printed file and a smile. He read it from a screen like prophecy, and the room filled with the sound of warm coats being handed to other men while I stood like a joke waiting for the punchline. Then the security came, a man with the kind of hands that had learned to move like authority, and he reached for me with a politeness that felt rehearsed. He called me by the wrong name to the faces that mattered most, and they clapped like it was a part of the entertainment. One of the sponsors laughed, louder than necessary, and a child pointed and mimicked the way they moved me toward the doors. Someone filmed it because everything is filmed now, and the video would be edited with a soundtrack that made the moment easy to digest for the world. The worst part was not the being let out. The worst part was the way the room stopped looking for truth and started looking for a story that fit the man with the hat. My old comrade stood on the edge of the crowd with a pressed suit and an expression practiced at detachment. He had been a friend once, and then a witness who decided the easier path was the cleaner one. He gave a nod to the man on stage, small and quick, the kind that could be missed by everyone but me. That nod was a signing of the papers that had always been out in the open and always hidden. When the camera cut to him, he offered a line about integrity and how this organization did not tolerate fraud. He said it with the same mouth that had once shared a foxhole with me, and the sound of it made something inside me burn in a way that was less about anger and more about betrayal. Outside, the night smelled like the river and the exhaust of expensive cars. I could hear the clip hit someone's phone and then the chant of judged voices rise in a chorus. A woman snapped a picture with a smirk and sent it, and within minutes strangers had typed verdicts on a life they had never touched. The moment that should have been a few free gloves and a nod of thanks turned into a headline that painted me as a liar and a thief. The humiliating thing was not what they did to me physically. It was the way they took the story and made it uncomplicated, made it neat. They wrapped my shame in glossy packaging and set it where it could be consumed without thinking. As they shoved me onto the street like a piece of stagecraft they no longer needed, I felt every kind of light I had ever served under become a bright interrogator. People stepped around me as if I had become something contagious. Someone called me a fraud and laughed like it was an easy joke. The dog tags I had worn all these years for reasons deeper than proof were ripped from my neck by a hand that wanted to taste power. He held them up for a photograph, glinting metal under the flash, and smiled with that practiced generosity while the crowd looked on. I wanted to yank them back and break the hand that held them, to show the world the skin and the scars and the forgetting. Instead, I breathed, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed the way my training sat in my bones like a sleeping animal waking. The shame was hot and complete, a thing that could have folded me, and yet in that hot shame something else woke, steady and cold and hungry for justice. The air after the gala tasted like cheap perfume and victory for the kind of people who count applause as currency. I sat on a curb and let it settle into my lungs, not because I wanted to breathe it in, but because it forced my body to slow down enough to hear my own thoughts. The shame was a hot coal in my chest, but the training that had kept me alive for years was colder, like ice in my veins. I did not cry. I catalogued. When everything inside me wanted to break, the part of me that had learned to brief a mission rose and started writing a plan in the margins of my head. The first thing I did was name the objective so it would stop feeling like pain and start feeling like a job. Objective, I told myself. Expose the man who turned my life into a punchline and make sure his smiling face no longer shuts down the truth. That was the short version. The long version had teeth. Show the public that what they thought was generosity was a smokescreen, prove the file they used to brand me a fraud was planted or fabricated, and force the people who signed away my career to answer under legal and public pressure. I wanted my name cleared enough that my service could be seen without the garbage stacked on top of it. I wanted the men who smiled in court and on stage to taste the panic of having their foundations and bank accounts pried open. I wanted them to feel small in the way they made me feel small. The target was obvious, the man on stage with the good hat and the better PR team. He had a name the papers printed with reverence and charities that used his logo to make donors feel safe. But names are easy. I needed weaknesses. He loved cameras. He loved being adored. He believed an image was more important than an accounting. That arrogance means he lived his life on a schedule that prioritized appearances over privacy. He counted on his team to make his guilt look like generosity. He trusted third parties to handle messy things. Those third parties left openings. I listed their predictable patterns. He walked his dog at 7 on the riverside path and ignored the park bench where a man fed pigeons. He used a boutique courier service that always delivered after business hours. His charity's public filings were glossy but thin on raw numbers. The security cameras in his foundation's downtown office had an angle that never covered the alley where the trash bins sat, a blind spot I noticed because a lens there always had a dead pixel. He kept one guy, my old comrade, on retainer as a board member because that board needed an ex-military face. That man liked to be in photos and hated messy paperwork. Pride and spectacle, that was their real currency. My assets were fewer but sharper than theirs. I had the homeless network that watched the city in ways no app could match. People who live with nothing learn why timing matters, who works nights and who gets lazy. There is a young volunteer I know, Sarah, who runs the soup kitchen and has a contact in the PR office at the charity. There is Malik, a kid who sleeps in a shelter but codes better than most interns and owes me favors because I once found his sister a winter blanket. I had a retired public records clerk, Mrs. Dwyer, who kept her mind sharp with puzzles and could file a FOIA request like a surgeon. And I had my own skills, surveillance patience, a memory for details, the ability to present myself as harmless or important depending on what the stage required. I drew up a phased plan in my head the way I would outline a raid. Phase 1, reconnaissance under friendly guise. Sarah and I would volunteer at a small event the foundation was holding, a food drive where the man with the hat loved to pose for pictures. I would be a faded veteran applying for help, a role the cameras liked because it made their honesty look better. Malik would be my eyes in the servers, socially engineering a backdoor by friending an intern on social media who loved bragging about work. Mrs. Dwyer would start a quiet record search for any odd transfers or shell companies tied to the foundation. I would keep watching the courier schedules and the dog walk, confirming every small pattern until prediction felt like certainty. Phase 2, collection. We would not plant evidence. This is not my way. We would collect what exists, receipts, internal emails, delivery logs, deposit slips. The courier would be the easiest weak link. If they left packages consistently after hours, someone was likely to leave paperwork in a bundle that went uncounted. I would find out where their trucks unloaded and wait in the shadow of the blind spot until a night worker admitted where he kept the manifests. Malik would mirror that with a pull of server logs and a saved copy of an intern's draft email that mentioned disbursement routing. Mrs. Dwyer would match deposit numbers with public company filings. Sarah would provide testimony from volunteers who remembered seeing staff move labeled boxes from the public hall into a private van. Phase 3, exposure. The world likes a clean reveal. It prefers a headline it can understand and a villain with a name. We would not leak to the first gossip channel. We would choose an investigative reporter I had seen break smaller but true stories, someone who hated being played by PR teams. We would hand her a file with hard numbers and a chain of custody she could verify. We would time the release for a board meeting I knew he would attend, the one where the men would gather in suits and smiles and think their reputation would shield them. I would be there too, not as a violent ghost, but as a living, breathing witness with evidence and a voice that would not be edited into a punchline. I set rules because war taught me that a mission without rules is something else entirely. No physical injury, no vandalism that would let them call me a criminal and drown out the truth, no traps that would hurt the volunteers I still relied on. I wanted names and receipts, not revenge for its own sake. I wanted the law and the court of public opinion to do the work that scared men in suits more than any threat of violence. I felt a sick little thrill mapping the moments when arrogance would make them walk into exposure. The strategist in me was awake, and the mission had become both purpose and prayer. When I finished my mental briefing, the city had moved on like it always does. People were still arguing about parking and taste in coffee. But under the bridge, a kid still played with a toy car and a woman sorted blankets into a pile. My plan lived in the spaces between those motions, and for the first time since the courthouse photos, my shame felt like fuel instead of a sentence. I stood up, checked my pockets, and started moving pieces I had been watching for months. The first step was small and ugly and necessary. Find the courier's truck when it unloaded tomorrow after dark. I started by watching him like I had watched targets in foreign streets, only now the battlefield was a riverwalk and a boutique coffee shop. He moved with an arrogance that was almost lazy, an ease that meant he did not expect anyone to notice the seams in his life. I learned his rhythm in days. He took the same route from his car to the charity office, pausing at the same bench to check his phone, tapping twice when a message was urgent. He drank black coffee at the same table and flipped his cufflink the same way before he answered a call. I mapped his steps in my head the way I used to mark safe houses. When a man decides not to hide, he makes himself predictable, and that predictability is the first weapon in a veteran's hand. Sarah became my cover at the small food distribution the foundation ran midweek, the one that never made the glossy calendar. Being with her gave me access to the back room, the place where volunteers dumped boxes and staff handled logistics out of sight. I spent hours there pretending to sort coats while actually taking note of cold details. A courier who always wore the wrong size jacket and smoked menthols, a delivery logbook kept in a metal box and never locked, the way lights in the alley blinked in a pattern that left a rectangle of darkness right where the box truck stopped. Malik, who could sweet-talk a password out of a bored intern, slipped me a picture of the courier's manifest after friending the kid who liked to post office selfies. The manifest had an innocuous name for a storage company and a route map marked with a shaded square, an address for a storage facility 2 blocks outside the district. Mrs. Dwyer did the quiet work that made me feel like we were taking the long, necessary road. She dug through old nonprofit filings and forwarded me scanned pages that smelled like dust and truth. Between the lines of glossy reports, I found transfers to companies with names that meant nothing on the surface, but showed recurring deposits timed right before his public campaigns. One entry had a memo line that made my stomach drop. Winter allocation followed by a contract number that matched a small construction company owned by a Shell trustee in the same building as my old comrade's office. When I saw that name, my hands went cold. I had thought betrayal was an abstract thing until a clean printed signature tied a man I had trusted to the ledger that had ruined me. The map was filling in, and the picture was uglier than I expected. On a damp Thursday night, I followed the courier from the alley to the storage unit. He drove slow, like a man who knows the streets and knows they belong to him, and he opened the unit with a key that jingled like a small confession. I waited in the shadow of a dumpster, the smell of old cardboard and diesel keeping time with my breath. When he left and the lock clicked, I slipped in because the only thing better than watching is seeing the bones of a lie. Inside the unit were rows of crates stamped winter stock and tarps folded like promises. I peeled back a corner of canvas and found bundles of deposit slips, a stack of invoices, and a ledger with his name on the top of a page where payment amounts and dates were matched with donor names. There were photographs too, candid shots of him at private dinners with councilmen who had voted on city contracts. The evidence smelled of grease and guilt, of men who thought the dark would keep them anonymous. The final thread I found was the human one, and it hit me like a thrown knife. Tucked between envelopes was a small, cheap invitation to a yacht party, an event he hosted quietly for major donors. It had my old comrade's name listed as guest of honor and an account code that matched the Shell trustee. Seeing that name on paper made every nod and the stage smile in the crowd mean something deeper and uglier. It revealed motive and collusion in the same breath. They were not just hiding money. They were laundering reputations the way they laundered funds, moving warmth meant for others into the pockets of people who did not need it, and using names we trusted to make it look legitimate. That was the key vulnerability. Their arrogance had them mixing pride with paperwork, and an exposed ledger, a storage unit, and a photograph were enough to crack what they thought was unbreakable. I left the unit with my hands smelling like diesel and a quiet certainty in my chest. The pieces were on the board, and now I knew exactly where to push. I set the bait where he would not be able to resist it, knowing full well that a man who built his life on applause would run toward anything that smelled like damage control. The plan had to be small enough to look like accident and sharp enough to open a wound. I could have gone straight to the reporter with what I found, but that would let them call me a bitter ex-soldier with a grudge and bury the ledger in hearings and lawyers until the story died. Instead, I needed him to move. I needed him to touch the thing with his own hands, while someone with a camera was ready to show the world how filthy those hands were when they pretended to be clean. My old training said make the enemy do what you want. That meant building a problem only his pride could solve. Sarah handled the social part without knowing all of it. She came to me with a worry about donor records, worried that a major supporter had complained about missing acknowledgments. She did not know the ledger was a map to corruption. She only knew donors hate sloppiness. I coached her voice into polite panic and told her to call the foundation's main office and ask for the original receipts tied to specific winter allocation numbers. I made sure the call was routed to his assistant, the one who panicked when cameras were nearby. I left margins for ego, because men who are used to fixing publicity problems will go fetch the fix themselves to keep their hands clean in public. Malik played the tech piece, pretending to be the board intern who noticed a confused email thread and forwarded it to me anonymously. He created a fake internal memo that suggested legal was questioning a specific box of receipts stored at the little facility 2 blocks out. The memo had a pressure point written into it. It mentioned a yacht donation line and a board list that included my old comrade, enough to make the man on stage sweat at the thought of a file being misread by counsel. We knew he loved to correct problems himself. He trusted his own hands more than his team's explanations. The memo was not forged in a way that would leave me guilty of fabrication, but it was precise enough to nudge his ego into action. I positioned myself at the storage unit under a pretense. I had told Malik to time a server error with a fake courier call so the staff would need urgent clarification at the unit tonight. That was the moment I expected him to move. In truth, I did not need to hack the system. I needed to be where his arrogance would bring him. I brought a cheap camera and left it disguised as a spare battery pack among the crates, angling it toward the aisle where anyone rifling through files would stand. I set a second camera across the alley, hidden in a dumpster lid, to catch cars and faces coming and going. The cameras were crude but good enough to show hands and faces in a clear, undeniable frame. The twist I did not fully predict was my old comrade's hesitation. When the message arrived asking him to come down and check the boxes, he hesitated on the call for a second that felt like an hour. He knew the man with the hat would ask him to clean something up. He knew how favors work when men owe men. But pride is its own kind of currency, the idea of being the one who fixed a problem in private and then smiling for the cameras at the next gala was a temptation he could not refuse. He texted back yes and left his tea cold on his desk. That small human pause should have been a miracle, but it only made the moment richer. A man who hesitates rarely leaves the stage. A man who moves for reputation always leaves fingerprints. When the car pulled into the lot, I felt a sting of something that was not quite victory and not quite relief. He walked with his usual practiced ease, cufflinks catching the light, the same man who had given me a nod in the crowd while I was being made a spectacle. He opened the unit key himself like a man who believed in managing details. He did not send a deputy. He did not trust anyone to touch what his name might touch in secret. He moved straight to the crate I had left cracked open earlier, the one I had arranged to look like an overlooked pile of receipts. He rifled through with hands that were careful until they found the photograph we had tucked at the bottom, the one of him with councilmen on the yacht, the one with my old comrade grinning like a man at a banquet. He pulled it up to hide it first, then held it out like a man who would destroy a thing no one should see. That was when Malik pressed his phone against the dumpster lid and the camera feed glitched into life on a reporter's inbox. That was when the cheap battery pack camera blinked red and the image of his hands and that photograph went from dark to bright in a way that could be played slow for the morning shows. He did not look over his shoulder until it was too late. When he did, he surprised himself by seeing a face he would never have expected to look back at him. Mine. And by then a journalist I had quietly tipped off was already asking questions into a recorder, the tape catching his name, his car, his arrival time. The trap was not violence. It was a mirror with a camera behind it, and a man who could not help himself walked right into it, thinking he was fixing something small while actually uncovering the ledger that tied his hand to the money. The night smelled like diesel and cheap paper, and the iron taste of justice beginning to be served. I sat in the back of the boardroom like a ghost who learned to walk among men with trophies, my coat buttoned against a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The table was long and glossy and full of hands that had always been clean in public. He walked in like a man who owned the room before anyone spoke, cufflinks flashing, smile already half ready for a camera that might not even be there. That arrogance is predictable the way a clock is predictable, and predictability is how you turn shame into leverage. I felt the old calm settle in my bones, the same calm I used to have before a raid, and I knew exactly what would happen because I had written every step in my head until it felt inevitable. He opened his mouth to speak about image and stewardship and giving back, the words polished to the point they could be swallowed without chewing. I let him talk until a board member who owed me nothing, and like the man for his celebrity alone, asked a question about the recent winter allocation discrepancies in a tone that assumed a PR answer. The man with the hat smiled like a shark smelling a friendly hand and reached for the easy line. That was when Malik fed the reporter the packet I had asked him to deliver just minutes earlier, and when the reporter pushed play the room changed temperature. On the projection screen the cheap camera footage showed hands rifling through boxes in a storage unit, and there in a single frame was the photograph of the yacht party with him and my old comrade laughing over a ledger. The image was quiet but heavy, the kind of thing that pressed on the throat without yelling. For a second he tried to laugh it off, to make a joke that would steer the light back to him, but the reporter had more than pictures. Malik had pulled the manifest entries and Mrs. Dwyer had mailed a printout of public records that listed transfers to an account linked to a shell company. I watched his face go from practiced color to a slow public blanching, like someone had turned off a spotlight under him. He reached for the playbook he assumed all men in power keep in their pockets, deny, distract, accuse the source, but I already had backup on the table. Sarah, who had once handed out coats with a smile, rose and said into the room that she had made the call asking for donor receipts and that she had been rooted to the man himself. Her voice shook, but it landed with the weight of a witness not used to being theatrical. The board members who liked him for photos started asking quick, sharp questions that sounded like nails. He tried to corner me mid-sentence, called me a liar using the old axe that had been read in court, but I had built a wall of facts around myself. Malik projected an email thread that showed his assistant asking legal about a box with a yacht donation code. Mrs. Dwyer read a list of transfers aloud that matched dates when public charity events were held. The ledger I had pulled from the crate sat on the table between us, a thin thing that smelled of diesel and paper and the truth. He tried the next move men like him reach for out of habit. He called my old comrade's name and relied on the old bond to save him. The room went quiet, and for a breath I thought I would have to do the hard thing and accuse a man I once trusted without a scaffolding of proof. Then my old comrade stood. He did not stand like a man about to lie. He stood like a man who had been carrying a weight he was no longer willing to hold. The first words out of his mouth were a kind of apology and a small confession that none of us expected. He said that he had signed papers because he had been told it would protect his family, that he had been offered investment strings that would make it look easy to help vets while moving money elsewhere. His mouth trembled and his eyes met mine once, full of the kind of regret that looks like a confession and like liberation at the same time. That admission was a detonator in a room full of men who had built reputations on neat explanations. Suddenly his nod in the crowd, the one that had helped make me a spectacle months earlier, fit into a pattern. What had been a private betrayal became public proof. Panic is a bad look on a man whose career depends on polished control. He tried to salvage the evening by promising internal audits and independent reviews and by calling the reporter a sensationalist. That was when the city auditor, who had been tipped by a neutral office that had received an anonymous packet of documents the week before, walked in with a subpoena and 2 officers in plain clothes. The crowd tightened into itself, board members whispering and glancing at each other, the sheen of the room beginning to peel. He grabbed for the ledger, for the certificates on the wall, for any prop he could use to stage a rescue, but his hands shook and his voice had no stage left to carry it. The cards I had put on the table, photos, manifests, emails, Mrs. Dwyer's printer-fresh copies of deposits, folded around him like facts finally forming a cage. He lashed out then, not with fists but with the language he trusted most, threatening lawsuits and slander suits and the ruin of reputations. It sounded weak. The board had been drinking from the same well of image for years, and now they recognized the taste of rot. Donations were paused, transfers were frozen. Men who had smiled for his selfies began to distance themselves, not out of sudden morality but out of self-preservation. When the officers took his coat and asked him to come with them for a few questions, the room did not reach for his hand. The cameras outside were already streaming live in a way his press team could not control. He looked like a man left to balance a reputation on a single thin plank while the world tipped. I did not cheer when they led him away. The victory tasted metallic and sour because it was not for revenge, it was for the truth and for the simple right to be heard. People will argue about methods and they will name me bitter or brave or something in between. But when my name started to clear the way, the paperwork unrolled and the ledger was read into logs, something in my chest eased. The trap worked because I made their arrogance do the heavy lifting. They exposed themselves by believing they could manage any narrative. I lit the match and watched the truth burn through the veneer. When the doors closed behind officers, I felt the old machine inside me relax enough to remember that justice is not always loud and quick, but sometimes careful and precise. And when it comes, it hurts the right people. They cut to the footage, and the room folded in on itself like a cheap suit being ripped in front of an audience. Within an hour, the video from the dumpster camera was all over phones and feeds, hands black with diesel lifting the yacht photograph, the ledger page with numbers that did not match the charity's glossy press releases, my old comrade's signature that looked small and terrible in the harsh light. People who had cheered at ribbon cuttings now scrolled with fury. Sponsors who had once queued to be photographed with him started issuing statements about transparency and unfortunate misunderstandings. The man with the hat tried to compose a speech, but the cameras were already lapping at his heels, and his press team looked like a rowboat with holes. The first real sound of consequence was not from a courtroom but from a bank. An attorney called me 2 days in, voice flat and careful, to tell me that several accounts connected to the foundation had been frozen pending an audit. I remember the exact way the line hummed in the background when she said pending, a slow legal pulley that could lift mountains or bury people. That freeze meant payroll stops, board members sweating, donors asking questions. It meant his yacht's brokerage had been alerted. It meant contracts with the city were put on hold. The world that had been his safety net of smiles and influence began to show seams, and I sat on my blanket under a shuttered storefront and let the news wash over me without cheering too loud. The newspapers were merciless, and so were the comment sections. An editor I had once handed a meal to at a shelter wrote an op-ed demanding not just resignations but criminal referrals. Social channels coined a hashtag that made his name trend in hours, and people shared clips of him ripping my dog tags for likes and outrage. The same footage that had been staged as entertainment was now a record of theft and cruelty. He delivered an apology later, a thin thing that tried to rename greed as confusion, but apologies are currency in a market that had crashed. The board split like bad duct tape, some dug in with public defenses, others fled like men abandoning a sinking ship. His political allies called for calm and got called out for hypocrisy faster than they could tweet a careful sentence. Legal consequences followed the media narrative like a second wave. The city auditor opened an investigation, subpoenas were served, and a federal investigator with a reputation for not tolerating charity fraud reached out to my contact, asking if I would be willing to sit for a statement. My old comrade volunteered more than he had been asked to give. He named names, handed over documents, and started a slow, painful process of making amends. There is no quick grace for people who sign away other people's lives for a quieter room. His confession looked raw and human, and it landed hard. He would face consequences. There were meetings about that, legal teams, and the kind of paperwork that strips a man of public ease. Watching him walk into that was not pleasure but a complex relief. I had wanted truth, not vengeance. Some of the people I feared would suffer the most were the volunteers and staff who had truly been trying to help. I made sure no action we took would leave them exposed. We handed files and manifests to the auditor in a way that separated the men in the photo from the unpaid temp who had been doing good work for nothing. The volunteers kept giving food out the next week, but under a different sign and with more scrutiny. Donors redirected money, afraid of association, and then some stewardship groups stepped in to manage the frozen funds so winter programs would not die because of one man's greed. Seeing that happen mattered to me more than watching his name get pulled from plaques. The city isn't clean, but the people still trying to do right deserve to keep doing it. There were attempts to push the narrative back toward me, suggestions that I had planted evidence that a disgraced veteran wanted revenge, because that is the playbook, muddy the water until everyone forgets the source of the stink. But the chain of custody we had kept, the storage manifest, the bank transfer logs Mrs. Dwyer had printed, Malik's server pulls, Sarah's recorded calls, all of it made the smear feel like a desperate flail. An independent reporter ran an investigative piece listing timelines and cross-references. People read it. People who had donated for years felt cheated and then furious. People who had ignored us for years started to ask questions that had teeth. The man with the hat watched his empire turn into headlines he could not edit. The proudest sound was quieter than the headlines. The Justice Department's knock when they needed statements and the sound of the public defender's office taking a call. I did not go to the first hearings. I watched it from a window in a room someone let me use for an interview, the light from a street lamp painting my hands as I held the cup of coffee they brought me. The reporters wanted interviews with me, with raw, camera-ready tales about the humiliation and the trap, but I found that telling the story was not about catharsis. It was about method and truth. I told enough for the record and no more. My name began to move through a different set of offices. The Military Review Board, a veteran affairs investigator, a lawyer who said there were grounds to appeal the dishonorable discharge. That last phone call felt like sunlight punching through a storm. There were small, human things that made the aftermath real. A woman from the shelter brought over my dog tags wrapped in a napkin and would not take my refusal to take them back as an answer, so I touched them and felt an old shape of myself settle into place. The man who used to feed pigeons on Tuesdays left a thermos at my door with coffee in it and a note that said simply, "You were always a soldier." It is easy to forget the tiny kindnesses when the world is rearranging itself in courtrooms and columns, but those small things were what kept me steady. I watched the chaos I'd engineered not with glee, but with the exact sort of calm I have when a mission succeeds. Quiet, purposeful, and aware of the cost. The city would not be fixed in days or months. Some men would crawl out with clean hands and tired smiles, and some would slide into courtrooms wearing suits that suddenly felt too tight. The foundation would be dissolved, assets reclaimed, and some men would face charges. I would eventually sit across a table from a board that had once spat me out and listen as they tried to explain themselves. I suspect there will be apologies and press conferences, and maybe a slow, bureaucratic, partial restoration of my name. For now, the work is to let the evidence do its job and to make sure the money meant for winter coats kept getting to the people who needed them. Watching them fall was not the end of anything. It was the opening of a new, ugly conversation that needed to be had out loud. I sat back, let the noise wash over me, and felt a kind of tired peace because the ledger was being read and the truth was no longer for sale. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday, thin and official, stamped with a return address I had almost forgotten and a phone number that might belong to the rest of my life. I held it like you hold something living that might bite, and for a moment I braced for another paper that would name me unfit or tell me my protests were only noise. Instead, there was a letter from the Military Review Board saying an investigation would be reopened and that my case would be reviewed in light of new evidence. They wanted to speak with me. The words on that page felt like sun through a crack, small but undeniable, and I sat on my bundle of blankets and let the breath come back in even for the first time in years. They called me in 3 days later and the room smelled like bureaucracy and coffee. A man who introduced himself as a colonel I did not recognize sat across from me and did not look away when I met his eyes. He had the sort of face that had learned to weigh things carefully, and when he spoke he said fewer words than the page had. He thanked me for doing what I did and for the proof that had forced their hands. He explained, without drama, that the department owed a debt of process to anyone whose career had been torn by false paperwork. He asked for my records, my testimony, and whether I wanted a formal hearing for reinstatement. My hands shook, but not from fear. It was like stepping back into a uniform and realizing the buttons were mine again. The offer that closed the last of the old wounds came from someone I had not expected. He arrived at the coffee shop where I took my first real cup after the hearings and sat down without ceremony. He was not the colonel from paperwork, but a man with a voice that remembered the cadence of command. He told me his name quietly, as if names matter less than the weight behind them, and said he had been following the story because sometimes the army fails people in ways that are quiet and slow until they are not. He had been my old commander, a man who once taught me to read a map and to wait, and he looked at me like a man who had been carrying regret. He offered me a clean certificate, the restoration of my rank on paper if I accepted, and more importantly, a place helping to run a new oversight program aimed at preventing what had happened to me from happening to others. I remember the way the word honor felt in my mouth then. It was not some shiny prize you pin on a chest, but something more like a path back into yourself. He handed me a small coin from our unit, warm from the pocket it had been kept in, and when he said the unit still had need of steady hands, I felt the old geometry of purpose rearrange inside me. It was not about a cushy job or money. It was about being given room to be counted as a man who had served, misjudged by men who hid behind suits, and finally seen by the system that should have protected him. He listened when I said I did not want a spectacle. He agreed I would have a seat at a table that decided audits and partner affiliations, and he smiled in a way that looked like permission for me to work. There was one condition I had not expected to be part of my restoration. My old comrade asked to meet in private, hands open and raw, and when he arrived at the oversight office he looked smaller than he had in photographs. He did not call me friend at first. He brought me the truth in a folded envelope and the names of people he had shielded. He offered to testify, to return money where he could, and to accept whatever came. There was nothing theatrical in his apology, only human weight. I listened and watched for the old soldier in me to demand retribution, but the mission had changed. I asked for accountability and restitution, not vengeance. He agreed, and that agreement felt like a small victory in itself, like a bridge rebuilt from timbers he had once burned. Reinstatement paperwork took time. There were hearings, signatures, and the small bureaucratic rituals that make right things official. Friends who had watched from the edges came by, and volunteers I had worked with brought warm bags of food and lent phrases like "welcome back" as if the words could repair everything. Mrs. Dwyer sent a congratulatory letter that smelled of old paper and crossword glue. Malik texted a photograph of a new office key on my palm with a simple caption, "Start date." The city posted articles that slowly shifted from scandal to reform, and centerpieces of the charities I had exposed were taken down and replaced with transparency boards. None of it was immediate redemption, but it was movement, and movement is a kind of mercy. On the first morning I walked into the oversight office. They tied an old ribbon I had not seen in years to a small nail on the wall. It was not ceremony so much as an admission that things could be better. They put my dog tags back into my hands in a paper towel because someone had thought of that small human thing, and when I put them on my chest, I felt a shape settle that was not heavy with pride but steady with place. My work would be to check ledgers, to sit in meetings where men in suits tried to charm their way out of questions, and to teach volunteers how to spot the kinds of fraud that had once been invisible to me. It was quiet justice and a second duty, and I accepted it with the kind of calm that had nothing to do with triumph. That night I walked back to the river, the same path I once watched men walk with confident strides, and I felt the city breathe differently. The ledger was read, the camera feed had done its work, and the men who built reputations on warm smiles were learning how thin their veneers could be. I did not expect gratitude or fanfare. What I had wanted was simple: dignity restored, my story heard, and a chance to make sure other men and women who had served were not quietly traded for clean hands. I am a soldier in a different war now, a quiet one of paper and truth, and every morning I put on those dog tags and go to a table where watches matter and where I can watch back.